I stared at the massive, gleaming meat cleaver in my right hand. Then, I stared at the plucked, tragically naked duck resting on the wooden chopping block. Finally, I looked at the 25 terrifyingly subservient sous chefs bowing so low their foreheads were practically marinating in soy sauce. I swallowed hard, the sound deafening in the silent, steam-filled kitchen. They say love is unpredictable, and today's story proves it. Welcome to Romance Crave Stories, where every episode is full of passion, secrets and emotional twists. Let's begin. Transmigration is a scam. If you read the web novels, you get hit by a truck, wake up in ancient China, and suddenly you have the skills of a master assassin, a genius tactician, or an unmatched physician. You slap faces, you conquer kingdoms, and you marry a brooding prince with a jawline that could cut glass. I fell down an escalator at a shopping mall while trying to catch a half-eaten churro. When I woke up, I wasn't a princess or an assassin. I was stuffed into the sweaty, flour-dusted robes of Bao, the newly appointed head chef of the Imperial Kitchen of the Great Yin Dynasty. According to the memories that had violently uploaded into my brain, the real Bao was a culinary genius. Unfortunately, Bao's soul had clocked out the moment the Chuo incident happened, leaving me piloting this sinking ship. The Emperor of Yan Lijie was notorious. They called him the Blood Tyrant. He was a man of exquisite tastes and zero patience. His last chef was executed because the rice was too loud. So here I am, armed with a cleaver, zero skills, and 25 men relying on me to keep their heads attached to their necks. Let the cooking commence. Chapter 1. I stood frozen in the center of the Imperial Kitchen, the massive iron cleaver trembling in my grip. The 25 sous chefs remained bowed at the waist, waiting for my divine culinary instruction. Before I could even address the naked duck sitting on the chopping block, a sudden, horrifying realization washed over me. I looked down at my flour-dusted robes. They were flat. Uncomfortably flat. My lungs felt like they were in a vice grip. I discreetly reached a hand into the collar of my tunic, feeling the thick layers of tight linen wrapped agonizingly around my ribs. Oh, you have got to be kidding me, I thought, my modern soul screaming into the ancient void. A fresh wave of memories violently assaulted my brain, confirming my worst fears. The original head chef Bao was not a man. She was a woman who had pulled a high-stakes, culinary Mulan. To save her family from ruin, she had bound her chest, lowered her voice, and infiltrated the palace kitchens. Disguising yourself as a man to serve the emperor was a crime punishable by death. Serving the emperor a bad meal was also a crime punishable by death. I was essentially speed running a double homicide on my own life. Chef Bao, whimpered the tallest sous chef, a lanky young man named Ashur, slowly raising his head. The 8 treasure duck. The emperor's head eunuch will be here in exactly 1 shurchen to collect it. Shall I begin boiling the water for the braising broth? Boiling water. He wanted me to boil water. I stared at the massive, roaring stone hearths spanning the back wall of the kitchen. They weren't stoves. There were no knobs. There was no digital display. It was literally just a series of controlled bonfires beneath giant iron woks. If I tried to boil water, I would likely burn down the entire Yin dynasty. No. Ikruaka. I cleared my throat, desperately attempting to pitch my voice into the gruff, authoritative baritone the original Bao had apparently mastered. No water, Ashur. Today we are pivoting. A collective gasp rippled through the suffocatingly hot, steam-filled kitchen. The disgruntled deputy chef, a man named Zhang who possessed the distinct facial structure of a highly judgmental pelican, stepped forward. He crossed his arms over his pristine apron, his eyes narrowing suspiciously. Pivoting, Chef Bao. Zhang scoffed, his voice dripping with condescension. The 8 treasure duck is His Majesty's preferred spring dish. To deviate from the menu is to invite the executioner's blade. Or have you completely forgotten the fate of Chef Lu, who served the Blood Tyrant lukewarm tea, and was subsequently repurposed as fertilizer for the imperial plum trees? A cold sweat broke out across my forehead, mixing with the flour on my brow. I haven't forgotten, Zhang. But tell me this. Is the emperor not a man of vision? A conqueror? A pioneer? He is the son of heaven, Ashur whispered reverently to the floorboards. Exactly. I shouted, slamming the flat side of the heavy cleaver against the wooden table. The sharp thwack made half the kitchen staff jump. And what does a pioneer despise more than anything? Boredom. Soggy, wet meat. Today we shock his palate. Sure, you will manage the fire. I am. Testing your fundamental heat control skills. Make it blaze. Outsourcing. The true mark of a modern corporate professional. Usher scrambled to the hearth, pumping the bellows until the flames roared like a cornered dragon. I turned my attention to the duck. I needed to cook it quickly, thoroughly, and without complex ancient techniques. I needed barbecue. I sprinted to the pantry, frantically opening clay jars. I found a massive vat of sticky wild honey, a jug of dark soy sauce, and a porcelain bottle of something that smelled aggressively like high-proof rice wine. I dumped them all into a wooden bowl, threw in an ungodly amount of minced garlic and crushed ginger, and whisked it together with a pair of chopsticks. Observe the technique. I yelled to the confused staff, plunging my bare hands into the sticky marinade, and aggressively massaging it all over the pale duck. I slapped the bird a few times for dramatic effect, hoping it looked professional. Now the spit. I commanded. Zhang, looking horrified by my barbaric methods, handed me a long iron skewer. I rammed it through the duck and marched over to the blazing fire Usher had built. I rested the skewer over the open flames. Within seconds, the honey in the marinade began to caramelize, dripping rich, fragrant fat directly onto the open coals. Sizzle. Hiss. Crackle. The smell was actually incredible. It smelled like a high-end street food market. But the fire was too hot. The fat kept dripping. Suddenly, a massive flame leaped up from the coals, engulfing the bottom half of the duck. Chef Bao, it burns. She screamed. Panic seized me. I didn't have water. I only had the leftover bowl of marinade, which was mostly high-proof ancient liquor. Without thinking, I hurled the remaining contents of the bowl directly onto the burning duck. Whoosh. A massive, theatrical fireball erupted toward the ceiling. The sous chefs shrieked, hitting the floor and covering their heads. The flames danced dangerously high for 3 seconds before dying down, leaving behind a plume of white smoke. I coughed, waving the smoke away, my heart hammering against my tightly bound chest. I looked at the skewer. The duck was charred entirely black on the outside. You fool! Zhang cried out from the floor, pointing a trembling finger at the blackened bird. You have ruined it. We are all dead men. Before I could defend my accidental arson, the heavy kitchen doors groaned open. Eunuch Wang, draped in opulent crimson silk, and holding a white horsetail whisk, glided into the room. His cold, dark eyes instantly locked onto the smoking, blackened carcass hanging over the fire. Chef Bao, Eunuch Wang sneered, pinching his nose. What in the names of the exalted ancestors is that? I wiped a smudge of soot off my cheek, grabbed the heavy iron skewer, and slammed the charred duck onto a priceless jade platter. Using my cleaver, I cracked the blackened crust open. A puff of incredibly fragrant, garlic-scented steam rose into the air, revealing meat that was, by some absolute miracle, perfectly tender and juicy inside. I stood as tall as my shaking legs would allow, puffing out my bound chest, and gave a deep bow. The Emperor's dinner, Lord Wang. I said, my voice barely a whisper. Tell His Majesty to prepare himself. Tonight, he dines on the fire-forged phoenix. Chapter 2. As an entry-level data analyst, I was highly trained in risk assessment and statistical probability. Sitting on a lumpy, oversized sack of glutinous rice in the corner of the Imperial Kitchen, I mentally constructed a spreadsheet of my current situation. Column A. Actions taken. Flambéed a duck in ancient liquor. Served a dish entirely devoid of the required 8 treasures. Aggressively lied to a high-ranking royal eunuch. Column B. Probable outcomes. Decapitation, disembowelment, or Zhang's personal favorite, being repurposed as high-nitrogen fertilizer for the imperial plum orchards. I ran the mental regression analysis. The p-value of my survival was decidedly 0. The pivot table of my life was looking incredibly bleak. You arrogant, uneducated fool. Zhang paced the length of the kitchen, his pelican-like face flushed with impending doom. He wrung his hands in his pristine apron. A blackened crust. A ruined bird. Do you know what the Blood Tyrant does to those who displease him? He doesn't just kill you, Bao. He executes your family, your neighbors, and probably your favorite childhood pets. We are dead. The entire culinary staff is dead. Statistically speaking, mass executions are highly inefficient for palace operations. I muttered, crossing my arms over my chest, wincing as the tight linen binding dug sharply into my ribs. I had to keep remembering to hunch forward slightly, adopting the posture of a beaten-down ancient chef rather than a modern university student. I miss Lagos. I missed the chaotic, predictable gridlock of the Third Mainland Bridge. Even the sheer terror of facing a 400-level functional analysis exam at Unilag felt like a tropical vacation, compared to waiting for an ancient Chinese executioner. Before Zhang could launch into another tirade about my impending demise, the heavy wooden doors of the kitchen did not just open. They violently burst apart. Eunuch Wang stood in the threshold, flanked by 2 towering palace guards clad in heavy black armor. The guards looked like they ate mountains for breakfast. The entire kitchen staff hit the floor instantly, their foreheads smacking against the stone tiles in unison. I scrambled off the rice sack, my flour-dusted knees hitting the ground a second later. I bowed my head, mentally closing my spreadsheet. It was over. I hoped my transmigration return policy was still valid. Head chef bow. Eunuch Wang's high-pitched voice echoed off the vaulted ceilings. It held no anger, only a strange, tight disbelief. His Majesty, the Emperor of the Great Yen Dynasty, requires your immediate presence in the Hall of Radiant Harmony. Zhang let out a muffled whimper into the floorboards. I understand, I croaked, trying to pitch my voice down into that gruff baritone. I pushed myself up, my legs feeling like they were made of overcooked noodles. I didn't bother dusting off my apron. If I was going to be executed, I was going to die looking like I actually worked for a living. The walk to the Hall of Radiant Harmony felt like a march to the gallows. We bypassed intricately carved wooden corridors, courtyards filled with blooming cherry blossoms, and ponds stocked with shimmering koi. The palace was a masterpiece of minimalist, soft aesthetics, all sweeping curves, muted gold, and rich crimson wood. Under any other circumstances, I would have taken 1,000,000 pictures for a lo-fi aesthetic vlog. Today, it just looked like a very pretty cemetery. Eunuch Wang stopped before a set of massive, towering doors guarded by more heavily armed men. He gave me a look of pure, unadulterated pity, then signaled the guards to push the doors open. The Hall of Radiant Harmony was massive, lit by hundreds of flickering silk lanterns that cast a warm, golden glow over the polished obsidian floor. And sitting at the far end, elevated on a dais behind a low ebony dining table, was Emperor Li Jie. The web novels had not exaggerated the brooding tyrant aesthetic. The man was offensively handsome. He had a sharp aristocratic jawline, high cheekbones and dark, heavy hair that cascaded over broad shoulders clad in midnight blue silk embroidered with silver dragons. But it was his eyes that froze me in my tracks, obsidian, calculating, and piercingly intelligent. He looked like a man who could solve complex differential equations in his head while simultaneously winning a sword fight. I approached the dais, dropping to my knees and pressing my forehead to the cool stone floor. This humble servant greets His Majesty. Rise, chef bow. His voice was a deep, resonant baritone that sent a completely inappropriate, unchef-like shiver down my spine. I stood up, keeping my gaze respectfully lowered to the level of his heavily embroidered boots. Out of the corner of my eye, I glanced at the jade platter on his table. It was empty. Not just empty. The bones of the duck had been picked entirely clean. There wasn't a single drop of my sticky, improvised garlic plum sauce left. The fire-forged phoenix, Li Jie mused, leaning back in his throne. He twirled a silver chopstick between his long, elegant fingers. A bold name. And an even bolder presentation. The exterior was entirely charred. The Ministry of Rites would call it an abomination of the culinary arts. It was a calculated risk, Your Majesty, I lied smoothly, falling back on the only language I truly knew, corporate data spin. A study in contrasting textures. The bitter char of the exterior acts as a disruptor to the palate, amplifying the rich, sweet viscosity of the honey glaze and the tenderness of the interior meat. It is not an error. It is a deliberate disruption of the culinary market. Silence hung heavy in the massive hall. I squeezed my eyes shut, waiting for him to order my head separated from my neck for speaking absolute nonsense. Instead, a low, rumbling sound echoed through the room. I opened one eye. The Blood Tyrant was chuckling. A disruptor, Li Jie repeated, the corner of his lips curling into a devastating, dangerous smirk. His dark eyes locked onto mine, stripping away my defenses. For 5 years, my chefs have served me the same pale, braised, predictable fowl. They bore me to death. But you, Bao, you have fire. You have chaos. Tell me, what other disruptions do you have planned for my palate? I swallowed hard, acutely aware of the linen binding digging into my chest and the sudden, intense heat flooding my cheeks. I assure you, Your Majesty, my menu is completely unpredictable. Good. Li Jie leaned forward, resting his chin on his hand, his gaze sweeping over my messy, flour-covered form with intense, unapologetic interest. Because from now on, Chef Bao, you will report directly to me. Every single night. Chapter 3. The next morning, the Imperial Kitchen was entirely devoid of its usual rhythmic chopping and synchronized simmering. Instead, 25 men stood in a perfect semicircle around my preparation station, staring at me as if I had just descended from the heavens on a flaming wok. I don't understand, Zhang muttered, rubbing his temples. He looked like a man who had spent the entire night aggressively recalculating his life choices. You served the Son of Heaven a charred, unstuffed monstrosity, and instead of ordering your immediate execution, he promoted you to his private evening chef? This defies all logic. It defies the sacred culinary texts. Logic, I said, leaning casually against the wooden counter while ignoring the sharp pain of my chest bindings, is just probability taken personally, Zhang. We gave the market what it didn't know it wanted. Ah, sure, my newly self-appointed disciple nodded furiously, though he clearly had no idea what a market was. Chef Bao is a genius of the unknown arts. What divine creation shall we prepare for His Majesty tonight? Shall I procure a shark's fin? 1,000-year-old egg? No, I replied, rolling up my flour-stained sleeves. Back in London, surviving a grueling 4-hour lecture on corporate tax law at UCL, followed by the sheer, soul-crushing anarchy of the tube at rush hour, required one very specific coping mechanism. Specifically the 2 a.m. post-pub doner kebab. It was the ultimate British student survival food. A towering architectural marvel of roasted meat, garlic sauce, and carbs. More importantly, it required absolutely zero complex ancient Chinese braising techniques. Today we are making the Pillar of the Midnight Scholar. Zhang looked like he was about to cry. There is no such dish. There is now, I declared. Ashi. I need a blacksmith to forge me a vertical iron spit immediately. Zhang, bring me the fattiest cuts of lamb you can find. And garlic. I need enough garlic to frighten away evil spirits. Also, find me some fermented yak's milk or whatever the ancient equivalent of yogurt is in this dynasty. The next 2 hours were a masterclass in aggressive improvisation. I had the sous chefs pound coriander, cumin, and rock salt into a coarse dust using a massive stone mortar. We sliced the lamb incredibly thin, marinated it in the spices, and then stacked it layer by layer onto the newly forged vertical iron spit until it resembled a magnificent, meaty traffic cone. Now, I pointed to the blazing hearth. We roast it standing up. Spin it slowly. Let the fat render and cascade down the sides. The grease will drip into the fire. Zhang panicked. That's the point, Zhang. The smoke creates the flavor profile. I yelled over the crackling flames. While the meat tower roasted to a glorious, crispy brown, I furiously whisked the thick, fermented milk with minced garlic and a splash of vinegar to create my makeshift garlic sauce. Then, I slapped a few crude flatbreads against the sides of a hot clay oven. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the palace courtyards in deep purples and golds, I had a massive jade platter loaded with warm flatbread, a bowl of pungent garlic sauce, and a towering mountain of shaved, crispy lamb. It smelled like a Friday night on Camden High Street. It was completely out of place in this pristine, delicate palace, but absolutely heavenly. Eunuch Wang did not come to collect the food. Instead, a heavily armed guard escorted me directly to Emperor Li Jie's private study, the Pavilion of Endless Scholars. The pavilion was intoxicatingly quiet, scented with sandalwood, old parchment, and ink. Li Jie was seated on a floor cushion behind a low mahogany desk, surrounded by towering stacks of bamboo scrolls. He had discarded his formal robes, wearing only a loose, dark crimson silk tunic that left an entirely inappropriate amount of his muscular chest exposed to the evening air. I swallowed a sudden, very unprofessional lump in my throat, dropped to my knees and presented the platter. The Pillar of the Midnight Scholar, Your Majesty. Li Jie set down his ink brush, his obsidian eyes drifting from the scrolls to the shaved meat, and finally to me. He leaned forward, the silk of his tunic shifting dangerously. A pillar of meat, he mused, his deep voice practically purring in the quiet room. And bread flat enough to slide under a door. Your mind operates in fascinating ways, Chef Bao. Most chefs try to impress me with intricate sugar sculptures of dragons. You give me architecture made of lamb. I am a man of structural integrity, Your Majesty. I lied, keeping my head bowed so he wouldn't see the sweat beading on my forehead. The room was warm, and my chest bindings were suffocating me. He picked up a piece of the flatbread, looking at it dubiously. How does one consume this architectural marvel? With your hands, sire, I instructed, demonstrating by mimicking the motion of folding the bread. You place the meat inside, smother it in the white sauce, wrap it, and accept the drama. Li Jie's eyebrows shot up. A dangerous, thrilled smile touched his lips. He followed my instructions, creating a perfect mini kebab, and took a bite. I held my breath. Li Jie kievet slowly. His eyes widened slightly. A drop of garlic sauce threatened to spill from the corner of his aristocratic mouth, and he swiftly caught it with his thumb, licking it away. It was a wildly unfair display of raw magnetism that made my London-bred heart skip a beat. Incredible, he rasped, his voice slightly deeper than usual. It is entirely barbaric. The garlic is offensive. The fat coats the tongue. It is a mess. He immediately took another massive bite. I love it. I want this served at the next ministerial banquet. I want to watch the Minister of Rights ruin his silk robes. A brilliant strategy, Your Majesty, I said, a genuine smile breaking across my face. He finished his portion, reached for a cloth to wipe his hands, and paused. His sharp gaze dropped to my chest, then back up to my face. I instantly hunched my shoulders forward, panic flaring. You are a very small man, Chef Bao, Li Jie observed, his head tilting to the side. Your shoulders are narrow. Your hands, though stained with cumin, are incredibly delicate. And yet, you command that kitchen of brutes with the authority of a general. You hide a great deal under those oversized robes. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird on the underground. I was born prematurely, sire. The provincial weather stunted my growth. Li Jie chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that made my toes curl in my cloth shoes. He leaned across the low desk, closing the distance between us until I could smell the sandalwood on his skin and the faint trace of the roasted lamb. A small man who cooks like a barbarian and speaks like a scholar, Li Jie whispered, his dark eyes sparkling with an amount of amusement. I think, Chef Bao, you are the greatest mystery in my entire empire. And I am a man who thoroughly enjoys unraveling mysteries. Chapter 4. Surviving the Imperial Kitchen was difficult. Surviving the nightly private dinners with a devastatingly handsome, highly observant emperor, who seemed determined to psychoanalyze me over heavily garlic-scented meat was exhausting. But the hardest part of my transmigration was, without a doubt, the chest binding. I stood in my tiny, unventilated sleeping quarters, unwrapping the suffocating yards of linen from my ribs. I took a deep, agonizing breath, my lungs expanding to their full capacity for the first time in 24 hours. I missed underwire bras. I missed sports bras. I would have given my left kidney for a comfortable cotton bralette from Marks & Spencer. Chef Beau. Asher's panicked voice echoed through the thin paper door, followed by frantic knocking. Chef Bao, you must come quickly. The Ministry of Rights has invaded the kitchen. I frantically rewound the linen around my chest, pulling it tight enough to make my eyes water, threw on my flour-stained robes, and bolted out the door. When I arrived in the main kitchen, the chaotic symphony of chopping and frying had completely ceased. The 25 sous chefs were on their knees. In the center of the room stood an ancient man wearing robes so stiff with gold embroidery, he looked like a walking tapestry. He stroked a long, wispy white beard, looking at my wok stations with an expression of profound nausea. Beside him stood Zhang, the pelican-faced deputy chef, wearing a look of absolute, triumphant glee. Ah, the so-called visionary. The elderly man sneered as I approached and gave a hasty bow. I am Grand Minister Liu. I oversee the culture, traditions, and elegance of the great Yin dynasty. And I have been informed that you have been feeding the son of heaven, peasant food. We call it avant-garde rustic minimalism, Grand Minister, I corrected politely. I call it garbage, Zhang chimed in, practically vibrating with joy. He made His Majesty eat with his hands, Minister Liu, like an unwashed barbarian. Minister Liu slammed his wooden cane against the stone floor. This insult to imperial dignity ends today. In 3 days, the palace will host the Spring Blossom Banquet. 200 of the most elite nobles, scholars, and foreign dignitaries will be in attendance. You, Chef Bao, will prepare a traditional 8-course banquet. If a single dish lacks the refinement expected of the Yen dynasty, you will be stripped of your title and exiled to the frozen northern wastelands. He turned on his heel and swept out of the kitchen, Zhang following closely behind like a smug, flour-dusted shadow. I stood completely frozen. My corporate accounting brain instantly booted up, running the mathematics. 200 nobles. 8 courses each. That was 1,600 individual plates of food. Back in London, if you needed to feed 200 people, you hired a massive catering company, or you ordered a catastrophic amount of pret-a-manger sandwich platters. You did not ask a 22-year-old tax law student whose signature dish was microwaved baked beans on toast to execute a flawless, synchronized, high-end culinary ballet. Chef Bao, Usher whispered, looking up from the floor with tear-filled eyes. What traditional dishes shall we prepare? The braised sea cucumber? The double-boiled bird's nest soup? Usher, I said hollowly, staring at the wall. We are going to die. Later that evening, I was summoned to the pavilion of endless scholars. I didn't even bother cooking. I just brought a plate of raw, aggressively chopped cucumbers, and slammed it onto Emperor Li Jie's mahogany desk. Li Jie looked up from a military map, a dark eyebrow arching in amusement. He was wearing an open, midnight blue robe, looking entirely too relaxed for a man whose head chef was currently experiencing a psychological breakdown. Cucumbers, Bao? He murmured, picking up a slice. Is this another metaphorical disruption of the market? It's a metaphor for my impending doom, Your Majesty, I said, dropping to my knees and letting my head thud softly against the edge of his desk. 200 people. 8 courses. Minister Lu wants me dead. Zhang wants me dead. I am going to end up freezing to death in the northern wastelands because I don't know how to braise a sea cucumber. Li Jie chuckled, the deep vibration echoing in the quiet room. He reached out, his long, warm fingers brushing lightly against my temple to tuck a stray piece of hair behind my ear. My breath hitched, my panic momentarily short-circuiting at the electric contact. I could override Minister Lu's decree, Li Jie said softly. I am the emperor. I could simply order them to eat your bizarre, fiery street food or face the executioner. I looked up at him. You would do that? No, he smiled, a wicked, devastating flash of white teeth. Because watching you scheme your way out of impossible situations has become the greatest entertainment of my reign. You have 3 days, Chef Bao. Astound me. I glared at his offensively perfect face. Fine. If he wanted to be entertained, I would entertain him. I needed a mass catering solution that looked elegant but required absolutely zero actual cooking. I stormed back to the kitchen, my mind racing through every posh British tradition I could exploit. It hit me like a double-decker bus on Oxford Street. High tea. It was the ultimate culinary scam. You take cheap, basic ingredients, bread, butter, fruit, and tea, cut them into tiny, crustless squares, stack them on a tiered plate, and suddenly it's the pinnacle of aristocratic sophistication. Aishi. Zhang. I bellowed, throwing the kitchen doors open. Wake the blacksmiths. Wake the carpenters. I need 53 tiered wooden stands carved immediately. Zhang blinked blearily, clutching a cleaver. 3 tiered stands? For what? For the Tower of Imperial Leisure, I announced, grabbing a piece of charcoal and furiously sketching on a chopping block. We are canceling the 8 courses. We are going to serve tiny, crustless sandwiches. We are going to bake miniature cakes. We are going to make scones and smother them in clotted cream and jam. We will drown the Ministry of Rites in Earl Grey tea and carbohydrates. Usher looked at the drawing, entirely bewildered. Chef Bao, what is a sandwich? I grinned, feeling the frantic, unhinged energy of a desperate student pulling an all-nighter before finals. Sure, my friend. Prepare to witness the greatest culinary fraud in the history of the Yen dynasty. Chapter 5. For the next 72 hours, the Imperial Kitchen operated with the frantic, sweat-soaked energy of the UCL library at 3 a.m. the morning before a corporate tax law final. You are throwing away the best part of the bread. Zhang shrieked, clutching his chest as if I had just stabbed him in the heart. Crusts are for peasants, Zhang. I yelled back, fiercely chopping a massive block of freshly baked flatbread into tiny, perfect squares. Aristocrats do not have the jaw strength for crusts. We are serving them the soft, pampered center of the wheat. Keep chopping. Usher was stationed at the hearth, practically weeping as he stirred a massive cauldron of fatty yak's milk. I had instructed him to boil it gently and skim the thick, yellowish fat off the top to create a makeshift clotted cream. Meanwhile, I had 3 men aggressively mashing strawberries and plums with raw sugar into a sticky jam. And another 5 meticulously slicing cucumbers, so thin you could practically read a scroll through them. Without self-raising flour or baking powder, the scones were the biggest risk. I forced the sous chefs to whip egg whites by hand until their arms were trembling, folding the foam into the dough to give it some semblance of lift. I baked them in a covered clay oven, praying to the gods of British baking that they wouldn't come out looking like hockey pucks. When the afternoon of the spring blossom banquet finally arrived, the kitchen looked like a war zone of flour, strawberry stains, and discarded bread crusts. But lining the wooden counters were 50 magnificent, 3-tiered wooden stands. The bottom tiers held delicate cucumber and smoked trout sandwiches. The middle tiers held the slightly lumpy but golden brown scones. And the top tiers displayed an array of tiny, intricately carved melon balls and honey-glazed berries. It was an imperial high tea. It was also the biggest bluff of my entire life. I wiped my flour-covered hands on my apron, adjusted the agonizing linen binding around my chest, and gave the signal. March. We processed out of the kitchen in a single-file line, carrying the wooden towers like sacred relics. The banquet was held in the Imperial Gardens, under a sprawling canopy of blooming cherry blossoms. 200 nobles, scholars, and dignitaries sat on silk cushions at low tables, dressed in an explosion of vibrant spring silks. At the head table sat Emperor Li Jie, flanked by Grand Minister Lu. The emperor wore robes of pale silver and crimson, looking so devastatingly regal that my breath caught in my painfully restricted throat. As we set the tiered stands down on the tables, the gentle hum of aristocratic conversation ground to a halt. 200 pairs of eyes stared at the tiny sandwiches. Grand Minister Lu stood up, his wispy beard quivering with righteous fury. He pointed a shaking finger at the stand in front of him. What is this insult? Where is the braised sea cucumber? Where is the roasted suckling pig? You serve the elite of the Yen dynasty raw vegetables and miniature breads. Grand Minister Lu, please, I said, projecting my voice to reach the entire courtyard. I bowed deeply, channeling the absolute, unearned confidence of a London real estate agent. To serve a heavy, greasy roast on the day of the spring blossom banquet is a profound insult to the delicate nature of the season. I gestured to the falling cherry blossom petals. Observe the aesthetic of spring. It is light. It is ephemeral. It is soft. The Tower of Imperial Leisure is an exercise in culinary constraint. It is designed to engage the palate without burdening the spirit, allowing the mind to remain sharp for poetry and intellectual discourse. To eat a roasted pig today would be the act of a barbarian. A murmur rippled through the scholars. In ancient China, framing anything as an intellectual, poetic exercise was an automatic win. Minister Lu turned purple. This is a trick. This is peasant food disguised as philosophy. Is it? Emperor Li Jie's deep voice cut through the courtyard like a blade. Silence instantly fell over the crowd. He leaned forward, his obsidian eyes locking onto mine with an intoxicating mix of amusement and predatory interest. He reached out and picked up a scone. He examined it, then looked at me. Instruct us, Chef Bao. How does one navigate the Tower of Leisure? You slice the round pastry in half, Your Majesty, I instructed, my heart pounding against my ribs. And then you apply the thick cream and the fruit preserves. Li Jie expertly sliced the scone with a silver knife. He paused, holding the spoon over the bowls of jam and cream. And which goes first, Chef Bao? The cream, or the preserve? I froze. He had unwittingly stumbled into the most dangerous, bloody debate in British history. The Devonshire versus Cornish method. The cream goes first, sire, I said firmly, aligning myself with Devon. It acts as the butter. The jam rests on top. Li Jie smiled, a slow, devastating curve of his lips. He followed my instructions, brought the scone to his mouth, and took a bite. The entire courtyard held its collective breath. Li Jie closed his eyes. The crumbly, buttery texture of the scone, combined with the rich, heavy cream and the tart sweetness of the fresh strawberry jam, hit his palate. He swallowed, opened his eyes, and looked directly at Minister Lu. Grand Minister, Li Jie said softly, if this is peasant food, then I have been eating like a beggar my entire life. He picked up a tiny cucumber sandwich and ate it in one bite. The court will eat. And you will enjoy it. It was a massacre. The nobles, initially hesitant, quickly realized that an entire meal based purely on sugar, carbohydrates, and heavy dairy was incredibly addictive. Within 20 minutes, the tiered stands were completely stripped bare. Dignitaries were fighting over the last scones. Scholars were composing spontaneous poems about the delicate crunch of the cucumber sandwiches. Grand Minister Liu sat in absolute, defeated silence, a dollop of clotted cream resting on his pristine white beard. From across the courtyard, Li Jie caught my eye. He raised his porcelain teacup in a silent, mocking toast, his dark eyes sparkling with a secret that belonged only to the two of us. You survived, his gaze seemed to say. I offered a small, exhausted smile in return. I had won the battle. But as the Emperor's gaze lingered on me, burning with a heat that had absolutely nothing to do with the tea, I realized the war to protect my secret, and my heart, was just beginning. Chapter 6. The aftermath of a successful catering event is a universal language. Whether you are in a sterile, fluorescent-lit convention center in central London or the sprawling, obsidian-floored kitchens of the Great Yin dynasty, the feeling is the same. Profound, bone-deep exhaustion. It was 3 a.m. The kitchen was finally empty. Ashur and the rest of the sous chefs had collapsed in their quarters hours ago, completely drained by the adrenaline of serving 200 nobles' miniature sandwiches. I bolted the heavy wooden doors of the kitchen, dragged myself to the furthest, darkest corner near the extinguished hearths, and did the one thing I had been fantasizing about for 14 grueling hours. I took off the binding. I unwound the yards of thick, suffocating linen from my chest, gasping as my lungs expanded to their full, glorious capacity. I let the linen drop to the floor, leaving me dressed only in a thin, oversized white silk undershirt and my loose linen trousers. The cool night air breezed through the open high windows, hitting my damp skin. I groaned, arching my back until it popped. I was a free woman. I was a breathing, unbound woman. I was also absolutely starving. I hadn't eaten a single thing during the afternoon tea anarchy. My stomach let out a violent, echoing rumble. I needed comfort food. I needed a late-night staple that cured hangovers, heartbreaks, and near-death experiences. I needed a bacon buddy. I scavenged the pantry. I found a slab of thick, salt-cured pork belly that looked remarkably like unsmoked back bacon. I grabbed 2 leftover squares of the crustless flatbread. I didn't want to wake the main hearth fires, so I lit a small, portable charcoal brazier and set a heavy iron skillet over it. I slapped the thick slices of pork belly into the dry pan. The fat immediately began to render, filling the quiet kitchen with the intoxicating, smoky, salty perfume of frying bacon. I cracked a duck egg into the pooling fat, watching the edges bubble and turn crispy and golden. To replicate HP sauce, the mandatory brown sauce of any respectable British bacon sandwich, I furiously mixed a dollop of tamarind paste, black vinegar, and molasses. I slathered the brown sauce on the bread, slid the perfectly fried egg and crispy pork belly onto it, and pressed the top piece of bread down. The yolk broke, oozing a river of rich, golden liquid down the side. I picked it up with both hands, closed my eyes, and brought it to my mouth. Is that the Tower of Imperial Leisure, or a new metaphor entirely? I screamed, dropping the sandwich onto the wooden cutting board, and spun around. Standing in the shadows of the doorway, illuminated only by the faint glow of the moonlight and my tiny charcoal brazier, was Emperor Li Jie. He was dressed in a loose, black silk robe embroidered with silver threads, his dark hair cascading freely over his shoulders, completely devoid of his usual imperial crowns or hairpieces. He looked ethereal, dangerous, and entirely too awake. More importantly, he was looking directly at me, at my unbound, thin silk undershirt. Panic, icy and absolute, flooded my veins. I violently threw my arms over my chest in an aggressive, defensive cross, hunching my shoulders forward so hard I practically folded myself in half. I bowed, my nose almost touching the wooden counter. Your Majesty, I squeaked, my baritone disguise completely failing me. I didn't hear you enter. Li Jie stepped fully into the light, his obsidian eyes locking onto my aggressively hunched form. His gaze slowly dragged over my crossed arms, the thin fabric clinging to my collarbones, and the slight, undeniable curve of my silhouette that the oversized shirt was failing to hide. Silence stretched between us, thick and heavy. He knew. He had to know. The Blood Tyrant was going to execute me right here next to my bacon sandwich. You are improperly dressed, Chef Bao, Li Jie said, his voice a low, gravelly hum that sent a shockwave straight to my toes. I was hot. I babbled, keeping my arms glued to my chest. The hearths. The fire. It is a known medical fact that excessive heat causes swelling. I had to remove my outer layers to prevent a spontaneous humoral combustion. Li Jie's dark eyebrows slowly rose. He took a slow, deliberate step toward me. Then another. He moved with the silent grace of an apex predator. He stopped on the other side of the cutting board, the small brazier casting flickering shadows across his offensively handsome face. He didn't call the guards. He didn't order my death. Instead, his gaze shifted down to the cutting board. "What is that?" he asked softly. "A midnight swine and yolk medley," I stammered. "It's a traditional provincial street food. For peasants. Not for emperors." "I am the emperor," Li Jie murmured, reaching across the cutting board. His long, elegant fingers grazed my knuckles as he picked up the sandwich. "I decide what is for me." He brought the bacon butty to his lips and took a bite. I watched his throat work as he swallowed. His eyes fluttered shut for a fraction of a second. The combination of the salty, crispy pork fat, the rich, runny egg yolk and the tangy, acidic kick of the makeshift brown sauce hit his palate. "Heavens," he whispered, opening his eyes. They were completely dilated. He took another, much larger bite, entirely abandoning his imperial etiquette. "It's the brown sauce," I said nervously, still clutching my chest like a shield. "It cuts through the lipid profile of the pork belly." Li Jie finished the sandwich in 3 efficient bites. He wiped a smudge of golden yolk from his thumb with his lower lip, a gesture so casually intimate it made my already compromised heart rate skyrocket. He stepped around the cutting board. He was now standing on my side of the counter. The space between us evaporated. I was trapped between the heavy wooden block and the towering, heavily muscled frame of the Son of Heaven. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing for the inevitable order of execution. Instead, I felt the cool, smooth touch of his fingers gently grip my chin. He tilted my face up. I opened my eyes. We were inches apart. I could smell the sandalwood on his skin and the faint, smoky scent of the bacon. His obsidian eyes searched mine, burning with an intense, confusing fire. He looked down at my crossed arms, then back up to my face. "You smell like flour, charcoal, and lavender," Li Jie whispered, his thumb lightly tracing the line of my jaw. "You tremble when I am near. You speak in riddles. And you hide yourself in the dark." "I am a very private man, sire," I managed to whisper, my voice shaking. Li Jie's gazadarkanat. A muscle feathered in his jaw. In the web novels, this was the moment the emperor began violently questioning his sexuality. The sheer panic in his eyes told me he was currently fighting a war between his imperial duty and his overwhelming desire to kiss his extremely suspicious, soft-jawed male chef. "You are a liar, Chef Bao," Li Jie breathed, leaning in until his lips were a millimeter from my ear. The heat radiating from his body was intoxicating. "And I am going to tear down every single wall you have built. Sleep well." He stepped back, the sudden loss of his body heat leaving me shivering. He turned and melted back into the shadows, leaving me alone in the kitchen. I slowly lowered my arms, my knees buckling entirely. I slid down the side of the wooden counter until I hit the stone floor, clutching my chest. He didn't know everything, but he knew enough. And worse, I was starting to realize I desperately wanted him to figure it out. Chapter 7. The next morning, I bound my chest so tightly I was practically operating on 20% oxygen capacity. If I tried to take a deep breath, I was fairly certain my ribs would snap like dry breadsticks. "Chef Bao, are you unwell?" Usher asked, eyeing me with deep concern as I aggressively chopped a pile of green onions. "You are terribly pale. And you are breathing like an exhausted pug." "I am fine, Usher," I wheezed, wiping a cold sweat from my forehead with a flowery sleeve. "I am just channeling the tragic, suffocating melancholy of the culinary artist." In reality, I was having a slow-motion, ongoing panic attack. Li Jie had to know. The way he had looked at me last night over the bacon butty. The way his thumb had traced my jawline. That was not how a bloodthirsty emperor looked at his mildly amusing, aggressively untraditional male chef. That was how a man looked at a woman right before he completely derailed her life. Or executed her. When dealing with ancient tyrants, the line between romance and decapitation was thin. Before Usher could offer me a restorative cup of hot water, the heavy kitchen door swung open. But it wasn't Eunuch Wang arriving to bark orders. It was 4 heavily armored imperial guards. They marched in, carrying a massive, intricately carved mahogany desk. They set it down smack in the middle of the kitchen, right between the roaring hearths and the main chopping stations. Zhang dropped his favorite cleaver. It clattered loudly against the stone floor. A second later, Emperor Li Jie strode into the kitchen. He was dressed in formal court robes of dark crimson and gold, a jade crown securing his dark hair. He carried a towering stack of bamboo scrolls. He looked like a god of war who had taken a wrong turn on the way to the battlefield. He sat down at the desk, unrolled a scroll, picked up an ink brush, and looked up at the 25 paralyzed, terrified chefs. "Do not mind me," Li Jie said, his deep voice carrying over the crackle of the fires. His obsidian eyes bypassed everyone in the room and locked directly onto me. A wicked, devastating smirk played at the corner of his lips. "I find the heat of the kitchen highly stimulating for my strategic planning. Continue your work." "Heavens preserve us," Zhang whimpered, practically melting onto the floor in a submissive bow. "He has come to supervise our executions personally." "Get up, Zhang," I hissed, kicking his shoe. "He wants lunch. We have to cook." Cooking under normal circumstances in this era was a nightmare. Cooking while the most powerful man in the continent stared at me with the predatory intensity of a UCL exam invigilator, who suspected me of cheating, was absolute torture. I needed a dish that was deeply comforting, aggressively British, and required minimal technical skill. I needed bangers and mash. "Ashi!" I barked, trying to sound authoritative while my voice cracked slightly under Li Jie's smoldering gaze. "Bring me the fattest pork sausages we have. And taro root. Massive quantities of taro root." I couldn't find potatoes, but the starchy, purple-flecked taro root would have to do. I instructed the sous chefs to boil the roots until they surrendered, then ordered them to aggressively mash the taro with heavy yak butter and salt until it resembled a thick, creamy puree. Meanwhile, I threw a dozen ancient pork sausages, which were usually dried and sweet, but I had specifically requested the butchers make them fresh and savory, into a sizzling iron pan. As the fat rendered, filling the kitchen with a rich, meaty aroma, I tossed in a mountain of thinly sliced onions. I rolled up my sleeves to my elbows, revealing my flour-dusted, suspiciously delicate forearms, and furiously whisked a splash of dark vinegar and bone broth into the caramelized onions to create a thick, glossy, bubbling onion gravy. All the while, I could feel Li Jie's eyes burning holes into my back. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, he wasn't looking at his military scrolls. He was looking at the way my hips moved as I stirred the wok. He was looking at my exposed wrists. He was completely, unapologetically staring. I hastily plated the meal. A mountain of buttery taro mash, 3 sizzling sausages resting on top, completely drowned in the rich, dark onion gravy. I wiped my hands on my apron, picked up the jade platter, and walked the 10 feet to his desk. I bowed stiffly, presenting the plate. "The earthbound dragons in clouds of white, Your Majesty," I announced. Li Jie set his ink brush down. He didn't look at the food. He looked up at me, his gaze dropping to the exposed skin of my forearms. "You have very little hair on your arms, Chef Bao," Li Jie observed softly, his voice a low rumble meant only for me. "And your wrists are smaller than the hilt of my sword." I snatched my arms behind my back, my face burning so hot I rivaled the hearths. "It is a genetic trait of my village, sire. We are a hairless, fragile people." "Fascinating," he murmured, his eyes glittering with dark amusement. He finally looked down at the bangers and mash. He picked up his chopsticks, easily sliced a piece of the sausage, dragged it through the mash and the thick onion gravy, and tasted it. He closed his eyes. The sheer, hearty comfort of the dish, the savory pop of the meat, the creamy starch, the tangy sweetness of the caramelized onions, was universal. He opened his eyes, and the amusement was gone, replaced by a raw, unshielded hunger that made my lungs seize entirely. "You continue to surprise me," Li Jie whispered, leaning forward over the desk, invading my personal space until I could smell the familiar sandalwood. A fragile, hairless man from a mysterious village, who cooks like a peasant but commands my palate like a god. He reached out, his thumb boldly swiping a tiny drop of onion gravy that had splashed onto my apron. "Tell me, Bao, if I were to command you to remove your oversized robes right now, what would I find?" The kitchen was entirely silent. The air between us cracked with dangerous, electric tension. I was trapped. The Blood Tyrant was officially flirting with me, and I was one wardrobe malfunction away from treason. Chapter 8. If I were to command you to remove your oversized robes right now, What would I find? Li Jie's voice was a dark, velvety threat wrapped in a promise. The entire kitchen seemed to hold its collective breath. Usher dropped a wooden spoon. It clattered against the stone floor like a gunshot. I stared into the Emperor's obsidian eyes, my brain frantically scrambling for a logical, non-treasonous, deeply unsexy excuse. "Scales, Your Majesty," I blurted out, my voice cracking wildly. Li Jie blinked. The heavy, romantic tension in the air skidded to an abrupt, screeching halt. "Scales." "Yes, sire," I babbled, leaning backward so far I was practically bending over the wok station. A highly contagious affliction native to my damp, miserable homeland of Londinium. We call it the Crimson Dragon's flaking curse. It is essentially aggressive, disfiguring eczema. If I were to disrobe, you would not find the smooth skin of a youthful chef. You would be blinded by a blizzard of dry, repulsive flakiness. Li Jie stared at me for 3 agonizing seconds. And then he threw his head back and laughed. It wasn't his usual dark chuckle. It was a full, rich, echoing laugh that made the armored guards by the door shift uncomfortably. "A blizzard of flakiness," he repeated, wiping a tear of mirth from his eye. "Chef Bao, you are the most spectacular liar in the history of the Yen dynasty. Very well. Keep your robes. For now." He returned his attention to his bangers and mash, leaving me to hyperventilate into a sack of flour. The uneasy truce lasted until lunchtime the next day. Eunuch Wang glided into the kitchen, his nose wrinkled in perpetual disgust, trailed by a nervous-looking palace servant carrying an ornate, silk-lined wooden box. "Chef Bao," Eunuch Wang announced shrilly. "A gift from the visiting diplomats of the Southern Wei province. A premium, highly prized cut of snow mountain fowl. Grand Minister Liu insists you prepare it for His Majesty's midday meal to honor our guests." I opened the box. Resting on a bed of ice was a pale, suspiciously perfect-looking bird. I narrowed my eyes. Minister Liu hated me. The Southern Wei diplomats had been arguing with Li Jie over border taxes all week. Giving me a raw bird and demanding I feed it to the Emperor felt like a colossal, neon-flashing trap. If this bird is tainted, and the Emperor gets food poisoning, Minister Liu will blame me. I muttered to Ashur as Eunuch Wang swept out of the room. "I don't trust it. We need to sanitize it. We need to completely obliterate any biological threat lurking in this poultry." "How do we do that, Chef Bao? Boil it in vinegar?" "No. Asi. We use the ultimate weapon of my people. The true, undisputed national dish of Britannia." I rolled up my sleeves, glaring at the suspicious fowl. "We are going to make a chicken tikka masala so violently spicy it will eradicate disease, evil spirits, and potentially our own taste buds." I ordered the sous chefs to raid the Imperial spice reserves. We needed cumin, coriander, turmeric, and cardamom. We lacked tomatoes for the traditional bright red sauce, so I substituted a concoction of mashed red plums, fermented chili paste, and vinegar. "More chilies," I commanded, standing over a massive mortar and pestle. "Bring me the dried Szechuan peppercorns. Bring me the little red ones that make the royal gardeners wear gloves. Grind them all." The kitchen air turned completely toxic. 2 sous chefs had to tie wet linen cloths around their faces just to stir the wok. I chopped the fowl into small cubes, marinated it in yak yogurt and ginger, charred it over the open flame, and then drowned it in the bubbling, blood-red radioactive curry sauce. "The crimson lava of Londinium," I rasped, my eyes watering heavily from the capsaicin in the air. I plated the dish over a bed of white rice, and carried it into the pavilion of endless scholars. Li Jie was deep in conversation with a visiting dignitary. As I set the jade platter down, the dignitary's personal servant, a quiet, shadowy man, stepped forward holding a silver flask. "A splash of finishing wine, to complement the Southern Wei fowl," the servant murmured, moving his hand over the bowl. I didn't like the way his hand twitched. I didn't like the way the dignitary was sweating. "Eat, Your Majesty," I said loudly, stepping between the servant and the Emperor. "Before it gets cold." Li Jie looked highly amused by my aggressive lack of etiquette. He picked up his chopsticks, scooped up a massive piece of the chicken absolutely dripping in the red sauce, and put it in his mouth. I held my breath. Li Jie froze. His obsidian eyes widened to the size of saucer plates. A violent flush of red crept up his neck, seized his jaw, and instantly conquered his entire face. He didn't politely chew. He violently coughed, spitting the entire bite of chicken directly back onto the jade platter. He gasped for air, his hands slamming onto the mahogany desk. Water, he choked out, tears streaming down his aristocratic face. The shadowy servant seized the moment of chaos. He dropped the silver flask, drew a hidden dagger from his sleeve, and lunged directly at the coughing emperor. But Li Jie, blinded by the spice and choking on pure capsaicin, wildly flailed his arm backward to grab his teacup. His heavy, silk-draped forearm caught the assassin squarely in the jaw. The assassin staggered, slipped on a puddle of spilled tea, and crashed face first into a Ming vase. The Imperial Guard swarmed the room instantly, dragging the unconscious assassin and the screaming dignitary away. I stood frozen in the center of the room, clutching my serving tray like a shield. Li Jie was leaning against his desk, downing an entire pitcher of water. He was panting heavily, his lips swollen and red from the chili paste. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and looked at the rejected piece of chicken on the platter. The silver flask the assassin had dropped was leaking a dark, strange-smelling liquid that was currently burning a hole through the floorboards. He tried to poison the finishing wine, Li Jie rasped, his voice a ragged whisper. He looked up at me, his chest heaving. If I had swallowed that bite of meat, I would have drank the wine to cool the burn. He slowly stood up. The humor was completely gone from his eyes, replaced by a dangerous, overwhelming intensity. He stalked toward me, his boots clicking sharply against the obsidian floor. I backed up automatically until my spine hit the heavy wooden doors of the pavilion. He didn't stop until he was inches away, his tall frame caging me in. He braced one hand flat against the door next to my head. You saved my life, he breathed, the scent of sandalwood and aggressive chili powder washing over me. It was the spices, sire. I babbled, my heart threatening to hammer its way right out of my tightly bound chest. I just really like robust flavor profiles. Stop lying to me, Li Jie growled. He raised his other hand, his warm, slightly callous fingers wrapping gently around the back of my neck. His thumb brushed over my pulse point, which was currently beating at roughly 200 beats per minute. Bow, he whispered, his gaze dropping to my lips. Or whatever your real name is. I don't care about the eczema. I don't care about the village of Londinium. Before I could form a coherent sentence, the Blood Tyrant closed the distance. He crushed his mouth against mine. It wasn't a polite imperial kiss. It was desperate, searing, and tasted entirely of danger, adrenaline, and violently spicy chicken tikka masala. My brain short-circuited. My knees gave out. I dropped the serving tray, my hands instinctively flying up to grip the lapels of his silk robe to keep myself from collapsing. He groaned into the kiss, his arm wrapping around my waist, pulling me flush against his solid chest, completely ignoring the thick layers of linen binding between us. Transmigration was a scam, but right now, pinned against a door by an impossibly attractive emperor whose mouth was currently ruining me for all other men, I decided I was absolutely fine with not finding a way back to London. Chapter 9. For a solid 60 seconds, I forgot how to breathe. I forgot my name, my impending tax law exams, the absolute chaos of the London Underground, and the very real possibility of execution. There was only the heat of Emperor Li Jie's mouth against mine, the crushing grip of his arms, and the overwhelming scent of sandalwood mixed with the residual, spicy fumes of the crimson lava curry. I clung to his lapels as if they were the only things tethering me to gravity. His lips were demanding, erasing every single boundary between emperor and servant in one breathless, reckless collision. But as his hand slid down from the nape of my neck to trace the curve of my spine, his palm flattened against my back. He pulled me tighter against him, his other hand moving to span my waist. And then his fingers drifted upward, brushing against my ribs. He froze. The kiss abruptly broke. Li Jie pulled his head back, his chest heaving, his obsidian eyes dark and glazed with a lethal combination of adrenaline and desire. He looked down between us, his brow furrowing in deep, aristocratic confusion. His large hand pressed firmly against my chest, right where the suffocating, rigid yards of thick linen were bound tight enough to crack a walnut. Bow, he rasped, his voice rough and laced with bewilderment. Are you wearing armor? Panic, cold and sharp as an icicle, pierced straight through the romantic haze in my brain. I slapped my hands over my chest and violently shoved myself backward, my spine smacking hard against the wooden doors of the pavilion. It's Kevlar, Your Majesty, I babbled, my voice jumping a full octave into a pitch that no man, premature or otherwise, could ever naturally produce. For the kitchen. The sous chefs have bad knife discipline. It is a preventative safety measure dictated by the Imperial Health and Safety Executive. Li Jie didn't blink. He took a slow, deliberate step forward, effectively caging me against the door again. He raised a hand, his long fingers lightly tracing the stiff collar of my oversized robes. "You do not wear armor to cook," he said softly, his gaze dropping to my neck, where a tiny sliver of the white linen binding was visible beneath my silk tunic. "And the Ministry of Rites informed me that you take your baths in absolute isolation at the hour of the wolf. You refuse to sleep in the communal quarters. You have the softest jawline I have ever seen on a man. Eczema makes the skin very supple, sire." I choked out, a bead of cold sweat rolling down my temple. "Take it off," he commanded softly. "I cannot. I am the Emperor of the Yan dynasty." Li Jie's voice dropped an octave, the playful amusement vanishing entirely, replaced by immovable authority. "I command you to unbind whatever it is you are hiding under those robes, Chef Bao, or I will call the guards and have them cut it off you." I squeezed my eyes shut. This was it. The gig was up. I was going to be executed for treason, deceit, and cross-dressing in the Imperial Kitchen. I took a shaky breath, my hands trembling as I reached for the collar of my robes. I slowly pulled the fabric aside, revealing the thick, tight layers of bandages completely flattening my chest. "I'm not a man," I whispered to the floorboards, bracing for him to summon the executioner. "My real name is Chloe. I am a woman." Silence. Thick, heavy, deafening silence filled the pavilion of endless scholars. I cracked one eye open. Li Jie was staring at my chest, and then at my face. He closed his eyes, tipped his head back against the heavy wooden doorframe, and let out a massive, shuddering exhale that sounded suspiciously like profound, soul-deep relief. "Thank the heavens," the Blood Tyrant muttered, dragging a hand down his face. My ancestors were beginning to weep at my nocturnal fantasies. I spent the last 3 days convinced I was losing my mind, aggressively questioning my own sanity, because I could not stop staring at my head chef's wrists. I blinked, completely thrown off balance. "You're not going to execute me for treason?" "Execute you?" Li Jie opened his eyes, a dangerous, thrilling smirk returning to his lips. He stepped closer, crowding into my personal space until I had nowhere to look but up at his offensively handsome face. "You just saved my life with a bowl of radioactive poultry. And quite frankly, discovering that the foul-mouthed, chaotic genius who feeds me as a woman only makes this entire arrangement infinitely more fascinating. But tell me, why the disguise?" The dam broke. The sheer exhaustion of lying to a monarch for weeks completely overrode my survival instincts. "Because I didn't mean to be here," I exploded, throwing my hands in the air. "I fell down an escalator in London trying to save a pastry, and I woke up in this body. The real Bao was a woman hiding as a man to save her family, but I don't know anything about her. And worse, Li Jie, I have to tell you the absolute truth. I have to confess." He leaned in, his expression turning serious. "Tell me, Chloe. What is it?" "I don't know how to cook." Li Jie stared at me. "What?" "I am a fraud," I groaned, burying my face in my hands. "The fire-forged phoenix? I accidentally dropped the duck in boiling oil because I didn't know how to braise it. The Tower of Leisure? It was just sandwiches. We eat those when we are too depressed to cook real meals in Britain. The crimson lava? I literally just threw every spicy powder I could find into a pot to kill whatever bacteria was on that suspicious chicken." I waited for the anger. I waited for the betrayal. I had humiliated the culinary traditions of his entire empire, using the survival tactics of a broke university student. Instead, a low rumble started in Li Jie's chest. He threw his head back, and a booming, joyous laugh echoed off the high-vaulted ceilings of the pavilion. He laughed so hard he had to brace a hand against the wall to steady himself. "You are telling me," Li Jie wiped a tear of mirth from his eye, "that you defeated the Grand Minister Lu with depression food? You conquered my palate with accidents and panic." "Yes," I mumbled, my face burning hotter than the charcoal braziers. "I am a tax law student. The most complicated thing I know how to make is a cheeky Nando's fake away." Li Jie smiled. A genuine, warm, blindingly bright smile that completely transformed his visage into something devastatingly beautiful. He reached out, gently wrapping his hands around my wrists, and pulled them away from my face. "Chloe from London," he said softly, testing the strange syllables of my name on his tongue. "You may not be a chef, But you are the most brilliant, chaotic tactician I have ever met. And if you think I am going to let you go now, you are entirely mistaken. He pulled me flush against his chest again, burying his face in my hair, inhaling deeply. Now, go back to your quarters. Unbind yourself. And tomorrow, you will tell me what a Nando's is. Chapter 10. The following morning, I woke up in my tiny quarters and did something completely revolutionary. I inhaled. A full, glorious, rib-expanding breath of air filled my lungs. I stretched my arms over my head, marveling at the sheer, miraculous absence of the suffocating linen binding. I wasn't entirely sure how I was supposed to survive the day. A woman masquerading as a male head chef in an empire, where such deceit resulted in 1,000 paper cuts to the neck, was a walking corpse. But Emperor Li Jie, the terrifying blood tyrant, had not only spared my life, he had kissed me senseless over a plate of radioactive curry. Before I could spiral into a complete panic attack about the logistics of my new reality, a sharp rap echoed at my door. Chef Bao, Eunuch Wang's shrill voice pierced the paper walls. An imperial edict from the Son of Heaven. I hastily threw on my oversized chef robes, leaving the linen bindings kicked under my straw mattress, and opened the door. Eunuch Wang looked at me with his usual expression of profound constipation, unrolling a yellow silk scroll. By the decree of His Imperial Majesty, Head Chef Bao's culinary techniques have been deemed classified military assets following yesterday's incident. Eunuch Wang read, his eye twitching. To prevent espionage, Chef Bao is hereby relocated to the Pavilion of the Fragrant Orchid, which shall serve as a highly secure, private test kitchen. You are to operate alone. Furthermore, His Majesty has provided you with new, tailored uniforms to reflect your unique stature. 2 palace servants stepped forward, holding a stack of pristine, midnight blue silk robes. I took the robes, my heart doing a complicated gymnastics routine. Li Jie was protecting me. By isolating me in a private kitchen, I wouldn't have to bind my chest to hide from the 25 sous chefs. He had essentially given me my own studio apartment, complete with diplomatic immunity. When I arrived at the Pavilion of the Fragrant Orchid, I nearly wept. It was a stunning, airy kitchen overlooking a private koi pond. The hearths were smaller, the woks were perfectly seasoned, and the pantry was stocked with every spice in the empire. I changed into the new robes. They were brilliant. They were cut in the traditional male style to maintain the illusion to the outside world, but the fabric was stiff and heavily draped across the chest, completely masking my silhouette without requiring a single yard of agonizing linen. I felt like a human being again. Comfortable. I spun around. Li Jie was leaning casually against the arched wooden doorway, his arms crossed over his broad chest. He was wearing informal robes of dark silver, his obsidian eyes sweeping over my new, unbound form with a thoroughly un-emperor-like level of appreciation. Very, I said, my cheeks flushing hotly. Thank you, Your Majesty. Though I'm not sure Minister Liu will appreciate me wearing silk in a kitchen. Minister Liu is currently drafting a 1,000-word apology to me for bringing an assassin into my dining hall. Li Jie smirked, stepping into the room. He closed the heavy wooden doors behind him, sliding the iron bolt into place. The sound echoed with a thrilling finality. We were completely alone. He walked slowly toward my prep counter, his intense gaze pinning me in place. Now, we have a matter of great diplomatic urgency to address, Chloe from Londinium. My real name sounded impossibly exotic rolling off his tongue in that deep, velvety baritone. We do. Yes, Li Jie stopped on the opposite side of the wooden counter, planting his hands flat on the surface and leaning in. You promised to explain the tactical maneuver known as a Nando's. Specifically, what makes it cheeky? I blinked. I had completely forgotten my panicked confession from the night before. I had to explain British lad culture to an ancient Chinese autocrat. Right. I cleared my throat, channeling the spirit of a UCL student on a Friday night in Soho. It's not a tactic, sire. It's a cultural cornerstone. A cheeky Nando's occurs when you and your mates, your trusted generals if you will, are exhausted. The banter is flowing. You desire sustenance that is quick, heavily spiced, and aggressively casual. Someone looks at the group and says, "Fancy a cheeky Nando's?" And boom! Camaraderie is forged over flame-grilled poultry. Li Jie nodded slowly, absorbing this profound information. A feast of brotherhood, fire, and banter. Excellent. You will forge this for me today. I wish to experience the cheeky Nando. I didn't have a franchise grill, but I had fire, and I had the ancient equivalent of peri-peri. I gravata fras, thankfully un puijunat chicken. Observe the technique, I said, wielding a heavy cleaver. We execute the butterfly cut, spatchcocking, to ensure the bird cooks rapidly and evenly over the open coals. Li Jie watched, transfixed, as I cracked the chicken flat. I moved to the mortar and pestle, aggressively grinding fiery bird's eye chilies, garlic, rock salt, a splash of black vinegar, and the juice of a sour native citrus that resembled a lemon. I whisked in some sesame oil to create a vibrant, violently orange marinade. I smothered the flattened bird in the peri-peri sauce and threw it onto an iron grate directly over the charcoal brazier. The hiss of the marinade hitting the fire filled the pavilion with an intoxicating, smoky, spicy aroma that instantly made my mouth water. While the chicken charred, I quickly chopped up taro root, fried them in hot oil to create makeshift chips, and threw together a pot of rice infused with turmeric, peas, and more chili. Behold, I announced an hour later, sliding a massive wooden board across the counter. The extra hot peri-peri butterfly chicken, accompanied by spicy rice and chips. It is customary to eat this with your hands, sire. Li Jie did not hesitate. The man had a tolerance for spice. He ripped a leg from the charred, vibrant orange bird and took a massive bite. His eyes fluttered shut. A soft, incredibly distracting groan vibrated in his chest. By the ancestors, he murmured, taking another bite. The acid of the citrus, the aggressive violence of the chili, the smoke. It is weird. It is perfection. He aggressively demolished half the chicken in 5 minutes, utilizing the taro chips to scrape up the leftover spicy oil on the board. He was making an absolute mess of his royal silver robes, and he looked happier than I had ever seen him. He finally stopped, grabbing a linen cloth to wipe his stained fingers. He looked across the counter at me. "You have defeated my palate once again, Chloe," he said, his voice dropping to a low, intimate register. He stepped around the wooden counter, slowly closing the distance between us. I backed up until the edge of the stone sink pressed against my lower back. Li Jie stopped mere inches away. He reached out, his warm, slightly spicy-smelling hands settling gently on my waist. "No bindings," he whispered, his thumbs lightly grazing the stiff silk of my new robes, feeling the soft, undeniable truth of my anatomy beneath the fabric. My breath hitched. "No bindings. Iakua beakli." "Good," Li Jie murmured, his dark eyes dropping to my lips. Because hiding such a chaotic, brilliant, beautiful woman in the shadows of my kitchen was the greatest crime this empire has ever committed. He didn't wait for my response. He leaned down, capturing my lips in a kiss that tasted of fire, smoke, and the best cheeky Nando's I had ever had. Chapter 11. Kissing a bloodthirsty historical tyrant was like eating a cheeky Nando's. Incredibly hot, slightly dangerous, and completely addictive. Li Jie's hands gripped my waist, pulling me so flush against his solid frame that I could feel the heavy, racing beat of his heart through the layers of our silk robes. I looped my arms around his neck, my fingers tangling in the dark, heavy silk of his hair. The spicy, smoky remnants of the peri-peri chicken on his lips completely short-circuited whatever was left of my rational, tax law-studying brain. I was officially in love with the emperor of the Yin dynasty. It was a logistical nightmare. Before the situation could escalate from a high-stakes kitchen make-out session into full-blown treason, a sharp, frantic knock rattled the heavy wooden doors of the pavilion of the fragrant orchid. "Your Imperial Majesty!" Eunuch Wang's shrill voice vibrated through the wood, sounding on the verge of a spectacular nervous breakdown. "Forgive this lowly servant's intrusion, but Grand Minister Liu and the Council of Elders have assembled in the throne room. They demand an audience regarding the Imperial Consort selection." Lia froze. He slowly pulled back, his obsidian eyes dark and tempestuous. A muscle feathered in his aristocratic jaw. He rested his forehead against mine, letting out a heavy, incredibly irritated sigh. "Consort selection?" I whispered, my heart plummeting straight into my stomach. The romantic haze evaporated, replaced by a sharp, icy spike of jealousy. "You're getting married?" "I am an emperor, Chloe," he murmured, his thumb gently swiping across my cheekbone. "The Ministry of Rights views my lack of an empress, and a harem, as a severe threat to the stability of the realm. They have been trying to shove a parade of heavily powdered noblewomen into my pavilion for 3 years. I have threatened to execute the last 4 matchmakers." "Well, you can't exactly marry your head chef," I pointed out miserably. especially one who is currently registered with the state as a man. Grand Minister Lu would have a stroke. Let him, Li Jie growled, his eyes flashing with a dangerous, absolute authority. He pressed a hard, entirely unyielding kiss to my forehead. Do not worry about the ministry, my chaotic tactician. I will dismantle their little council. Stay here. Stay hidden. I will return tonight. He swept out of the kitchen, his crimson and silver robes billowing behind him like a storm cloud. The heavy wooden doors clicked shut, leaving me completely alone in the pristine pavilion. I slumped against the stone counter. Staying hidden was not in my nature. I needed to understand the enemy. Back in London, when I needed to disassociate from the crushing reality of my university exams, I ran a small, aesthetic study with me channel. Editing those videos required an intense, borderline obsessive mastery of DaVinci Resolve. Building a custom aesthetic timer, or a sleek progress bar on the Fusion page meant connecting dozens of complex nodes and macros. If one input was misaligned, the entire visual tree collapsed into a digital disaster. Court politics, I realized, grabbing a piece of charcoal and turning to a pristine wooden chopping block, was like a massive corrupted Fusion node tree. I started drawing. I made a large circle in the center. Emperor Li Jie, media out node. Above him, I drew a massive, aggressive square. Grand Minister Lu corrupted macro. Lu was feeding toxic data, noble consorts, traditional laws, assassins, directly into the Emperor's pipeline. To fix the tree, I couldn't just delete Minister Lu. That would cause a system-wide crash, a rebellion. I needed to build a bypass node. I needed to fundamentally rewrite the court's output, so that Lu's influence was rendered obsolete. But how did a chef disrupt a political node tree? With carbohydrates, obviously. I wiped the charcoal dust from my hands and grabbed a massive sack of flour. If the Ministry of Rights wanted a display of imperial stability, I would give them a visual representation of the Emperor's unbreakable, complex power. Before I fell down that fateful escalator, I had been meticulously planning a small crochet side business targeting my fellow university students. I had the tension, the yardage, and the complex yarn math memorized for intricate halter tops and accessories. Dough, I realized with a sudden spark of manic inspiration, was essentially just edible yarn. Right. I muttered to myself, rolling up my midnight blue silk sleeves. Let's calculate the tension. I mixed flour, water, yeast, and a massive amount of rich yak butter, kneading the dough until it was as smooth and elastic as high-quality cotton yarn. I let it rise, then punched it down, feeling the satisfying release of air. Then the yarn math began. I kneaded 36 individual strands of dough, each 24 inches long, rolled to an identical thickness. I floured the massive wooden counter, and laid the strands out side by side. Taking a deep breath, I began to weave. Over 2, under 3, crossing the horizontal strands with the vertical ones, applying the exact mathematical tension I would use for a complex cable knit crochet pattern. I worked furiously, my fingers flying over the dough, braiding, twisting, and locking the strands together into a towering, impossible knot of bread. It looked like a mesmerizing, golden mandala. It was structurally sound, visually, and completely interwoven. I brushed the entire monstrosity with an egg wash, sprinkled it with coarse sea salt and black sesame seeds, and shoved it into the hottest clay oven. 2 hours later, Eunuch Wang returned to the pavilion. He looked utterly exhausted, his shoulders slumped. Chef Bao, His Majesty requests your presence in the throne room. The Council of Elders is agitated. Perfect, I said, grabbing my heavy leather oven mitts. I pulled the massive, intricately woven bread out of the clay oven. It had baked into a flawless, mahogany brown masterpiece. Grab a platter, Lord Wang. We are taking the node tree of absolute authority to court. Chapter 12. The throne room of the Great Yan dynasty was designed to make a person feel like an insignificant speck of dust. Towering pillars of red lacquer and gold leaf stretched up to a ceiling painted with swirling dragons. The obsidian floor was polished to such a high shine it perfectly reflected the terrified faces of anyone who walked across it. I marched across that floor carrying a jade platter the size of a manhole cover, upon which rested my towering, golden brown, 36-strand masterpiece of baked carbohydrate geometry. Eunuch Wang trailed nervously behind me. Ahead, at the far end of the hall, Emperor Li Jie sat on his elevated golden throne. He was leaning on one elbow, looking thoroughly bored and entirely lethal. Arrayed before him on the steps of the dais were Grand Minister Lu and 12 elderly men draped in heavily embroidered scholars' robes. The Council of Elders. They had unrolled dozens of silk paintings across the floor, each depicting a beautiful, delicate noblewoman playing a zither, arranging flowers, or looking pensively at a plum blossom. Your Majesty, the daughter of General Han brings military alliances, Grand Minister Lu was droning on, pointing to a painting of a girl who looked no older than 16. And the niece of the southern governor brings wealth. You must choose an empress to anchor the dynasty. I would rather anchor myself to the bottom of the koi pond, Li Jie muttered darkly. His eyes snapped up as I approached. The absolute relief that washed over his devastatingly handsome face was immediately replaced by a look of profound confusion as he took in the massive, intricately woven bread on my platter. I stopped right behind the line of elders, bowed low, and cleared my throat. Pardon the interruption, Your Majesty, but His Imperial Highness requires his afternoon snack. Grand Minister Lu spun around, his wispy beard vibrating with outrage. A snack? We are discussing the future of the imperial bloodline, you insolent cook. Get out. Let him approach, Li Jie commanded, his voice cutting through the massive hall like a whip. The elders parted, glaring daggers at my new midnight blue silk robes. I stepped up to the dais and presented the platter. Chef Bao, Li Jie murmured, leaning forward. His obsidian eyes danced with suppressed amusement. What in the name of the ancestors is this? This, Your Majesty, I announced, projecting my voice so every dusty old man in the room could hear me, is the mandala of absolute sovereign tension. The Council of Elders exchanged bewildered glances. It appears to be a very large, knotted loaf of peasant wheat, Minister Lu sneered. It is an architectural marvel of structural integrity, Minister Lu, I countered, channeling the unshakable confidence of a UCL law professor destroying a first-year student's argument. Observe the weave. 36 individual strands of dough, perfectly mathematically interlocked. Over 2 under 3. Each strand represents a province, a military division, or a ministry of the Yan dynasty. I set the heavy platter down on the edge of the emperor's desk. The strength of this structure relies entirely on even tension. If one strand is too thick or pulled too tightly, the entire matrix collapses. The bread tears. The structure fails. Li Jie's eyes darkened with sudden understanding. He sat back, crossing his arms. Continue, Chef Bao. If Your Majesty were to arbitrarily bind one of these strands to, say, a highly ambitious noble family, I gestured vaguely to the silk paintings of the potential brides. You introduce a corrupted variable into a perfectly balanced system. The tension becomes unequal. You give one family a monopoly on the throne's influence. You do not anchor the dynasty, Minister Lu. You fray the yarn. You unravel the empire. Absolute, deafening silence fell over the throne room. In ancient China, framing a political argument inside a complex, poetic metaphor was the ultimate power move. I had just used the structural logic of a crochet halter top to dismantle a hostile political takeover, and the Council of Elders didn't have a single counter-argument. Minister Lu turned an alarming shade of plum. You dare compare the sacred selection of an empress to the baking of bread? You are a chef. You know nothing of statecraft. A chef understands balance, Minister Lu, Li Jie said softly. His voice sent a shiver down my spine. He stood up, towering over the assembly, his presence entirely dominating the massive room. Chef Bao understands that if you add salt to a dish that requires sugar, you ruin the meal. You elders seek to force an unwanted variable into my court. Li Jie stepped down from the throne. He walked over to the silk paintings and deliberately stepped right on the face of the southern governor's niece. He stopped directly in front of me. He was so close I could smell the sandalwood and the faint lingering spice of the cheeky Nandos. I will not take a noble consort, Li Jie declared, his eyes locked onto mine, burning with a fierce, possessive heat that made my heart hammer wildly against my ribs. My court is already perfectly woven. The tension is exact. The matter is permanently closed. He reached out, grabbed a thick, crusty piece of the braided bread, and ripped it off the loaf. He took a bite, maintaining absolute, unyielding eye contact with me. Flawless execution, Chef Bao, he murmured. Minister Lu looked as if he was going to spontaneously combust. He slammed his wooden cane against the obsidian floor. This is madness. Your Majesty, you allow a peasant cook to dictate imperial policy. If this boy is so brilliant, If his understanding of balance is so divine, then let him prove it. Lu pointed a trembling, accusatory finger at me. The Imperial Grand Culinary Exam is in 3 days. 3 elder judges from the most elite provinces will test the head chef. If he cannot execute the highest forms of traditional, classical court cuisine, without his barbaric spices and peasant tricks, then he is a fraud. And by law, a fraud in the Imperial Kitchen is put to death. My stomach plummeted. The high of my crochet bread victory evaporated instantly. I am the Emperor, Li Jie snarled, stepping between me and the minister. I dictate the law. He will not take your exam. He must. Lu shouted back, his face purple. Or the Council of Elders will formally petition the regional governors to intervene. You cannot shield an incompetent chef from the traditions of the ancestors without risking a rebellion. Li Jie's hand flew to the hilt of the ceremonial sword at his hip. The guards by the doors instantly snapped to attention. We were seconds away from a bloodbath. I'll do it, I blurted out. Li Jie spun around to look at me, his eyes wide with shock. Chloe, he started, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper so only I could hear. You don't know how to cook a traditional banquet. They will kill you. I am a student of Londinium, Your Majesty, I whispered back, my voice trembling but determined. We survive entirely on caffeine, panic, and last-minute cramming. I have 3 days to learn how to be a Michelin star ancient Chinese chef. I looked past him to the furious Grand Minister. I accept the challenge, Minister Lu. Prepare your judges. Chapter 13. The moment the heavy wooden doors of the throne room closed behind us, my knees gave out. I would have face planted directly onto the obsidian floor if Emperor Li Jie hadn't caught me by the elbows. You are a lunatic, Li Jie hissed, hauling me upright and dragging me down the corridor to the safety of the pavilion of the fragrant orchid. 3 days, Chloe? You serve me deep-fried batter and bacon. You don't even know how to hold chopsticks properly, let alone execute a classical imperial banquet. I panicked. I groaned, burying my face in my hands. He was going to cause a rebellion. I couldn't let him use my incompetence to threaten your throne. Li Jie stopped, his expression softening instantly. He gently pulled my hands away from my face, his obsidian eyes dark with an emotion that made my breath catch. You risked your life to stabilize my court? I'm a tax law student, sire, I whimpered. We have a pathological need to fix broken systems. Also, I am quite fond of my head. And yours. I will not let them execute you, he vowed softly, pressing a kiss to my knuckles. I will have the judges bribed. Or kidnapped. Kidnapping is highly effective. No, I said, a spark of desperate, frantic determination igniting in my chest. If my time at UCL had taught me anything, it was that sheer, unadulterated panic was the ultimate study aid. No cheating. I am going to learn how to cook. But I need a tutor. 10 minutes later, I stood in the main Imperial Kitchen, bowing so low to Zhang that my nose practically touched my knees. The pelican-faced deputy chef stared at me, his jaw unhinged. You, the so-called visionary head chef, are asking me how to braise? I am begging you, Zhang, I pleaded. I have 3 days to master the Grand Culinary Exam. If I fail, Minister Lu executes me. And if I am exposed as a fraud, Lu will execute the entire kitchen staff for complicity. Zhang went deathly pale. He hated me, but he loved his neck significantly more. He grabbed a massive, sharp meat cleaver and slammed it into the chopping block. Fine, Zhang snarled. But we do this my way. No deep frying. No pesen breath. No barbaric street food from Londinium. The next 72 hours were a blur of agonizing, blistering pain. It was the ultimate cram session. Zhang didn't just teach me how to cook. He rebuilt my muscle memory from the ground up. I chopped mountains of daikon radishes until my fingers bled and calloused. I stood over roaring hearth fires until my eyebrows were singed, learning the microsecond timing of wok hei, the breath of the wok. I didn't sleep. I survived entirely on green tea and raw adrenaline. When the morning of the Grand Culinary Exam finally dawned, I looked like a ghost who had been dragged backward through a flour mill. The exam was held in the central courtyard. 3 elderly judges from the most elite culinary provinces sat behind a long mahogany table, their faces carved from stone. Grand Minister Lu stood beside them, practically vibrating with smug anticipation. Emperor Li Jie sat on his throne at the head of the courtyard, his posture rigid, his eyes tracking my every move with intensity. Chef Bao, the head judge wheezed, his voice like dry parchment. You must present 2 courses. A traditional savory showpiece, and a delicate dessert to demonstrate refinement. You have 2 Shirchen. Begin. I took a deep breath, letting the chaotic, panicked noise of my modern brain fade away. I closed my eyes and pictured the sequence of steps, visualizing them like a perfectly structured flowchart. First, the savory showpiece, the classical sweet and sour carp. I grabbed a massive live carp. With the precision Zhang had drilled into me, I dispatched, scaled, and gutted it in under a minute. Then came the hardest part, the knife work. I had to score the flesh of the fish in a complex crosshatch pattern, cutting deep enough to open the meat, but stopping a millimeter before severing the skin. I held my breath, the cleaver flying. When I lifted the fish by the tail and dusted it in cornstarch, the scored meat flared outward like a blooming chrysanthemum. I gently lowered it into a wok of hot oil. It sizzled and popped, the flesh locking into that stunning floral shape. I quickly whisked together a vibrant, ruby-red sauce of black vinegar, ginger and sugar, pouring it over the golden, crispy fish just as the timer for the first course was called. The judges tasted it. The courtyard was dead silent. The head judge chewed slowly. He blinked. He looked at the fish, then at me. The knife work is flawless. The exterior is crisp, the interior tender. The sauce is perfectly balanced. Minister Lu looked like he had swallowed a live wasp. But the dessert will reveal his true refinement, Lu hissed. A peasant cannot mimic elegance. He was right. Traditional court desserts were intricate sugar sculptures and complex, labor-intensive jellies. I didn't have the time or the skill for that. But I knew what elegance looked like. I understood aesthetics. I needed to create a plate that felt like a quiet, soft morning in a corner cafe, something minimalist, calming, and visually soothing. I pivoted. I took finely milled rice flour and steamed it into an incredibly soft, pliant dough. I ground premium green tea leaves into a fine, vibrant matcha powder, folding it into half of the dough to create a muted, calming pastel green. For the filling, I mashed wild mountain strawberries with a touch of honey, cooking it down into a smooth, soft pink paste. I meticulously formed the dough into small, perfect spheres, wrapping the soft green exterior around the sweet, pastel pink strawberry center. I dusted them lightly with roasted soybean flour, and plated them on a dark slate board alongside a single, delicate sprig of purple lavender I had snuck from the Imperial Gardens. The visual contrast was stunning. It wasn't a towering dragon made of sugar. It was soft, minimalist, and deeply aesthetic. It looked like a lo-fi study session translated into food. The softness of spring, I announced, placing the slate before the judges. The head judge picked up a pastel green sphere with his chopsticks and took a bite. The soft, chewy texture of the rice dough gave way to the earthy, slightly bitter matcha, which was instantly balanced by the bright, sweet burst of the wild strawberry filling. He closed his eyes. A long, profound sigh escaped his lips. It is poetry, the judge whispered, staring at the remaining half of the dessert in absolute awe. It does not scream for attention. It simply exists in perfect, soft harmony. It calms the spirit. He slammed his wooden gavel onto the table. Chef Bao of the Imperial Kitchen has passed the grand culinary exam with the highest honors. The courtyard erupted. Ashur and Zhang were hugging each other and sobbing by the hearths. I looked up at the throne. Li Jie was standing, his hands resting on the hilt of his sword. He wasn't smiling, but the look of raw, overwhelming pride and possessive heat in his dark eyes hit me harder than a physical blow. Minister Lu, however, was not finished. He stepped forward, his face twisted in a mask of desperate fury. He passed the cooking exam. Lu shouted over the cheers. But he is still unfit. Your Majesty, a messenger arrived this morning from the Northern Kingdom. They are sending Princess Aylin to be your bride. If you reject her for no reason, it means war. You must marry her, and this peasant cook cannot stop it. My triumphant smile completely vanished. I had survived the fire, but it seemed the frying pan was waiting right around the corner. Chapter 14. Va. The word echoed in my brain, bouncing around my skull like a panicked pigeon trapped in a tube station. He said war. I was frantically sprinting around the pavilion of the fragrant orchid, throwing my few possessions into a silk sack. I grabbed my lucky wooden spatula, a jar of the radioactive peri-peri marinade, and a spare midnight blue tunic. I was a tax law student, not Helen of Troy. I was absolutely not going to be the reason thousands of ancient soldiers perished on a battlefield, because the Emperor developed a sudden, fatal addiction to British comfort food and my unbound chest. Chloe, what are you doing? Li Jie stood in the doorway, having magically bypassed the frantic palace guards. He had discarded his formal court crown, his dark hair falling loose around his shoulders. He didn't look like a man on the brink of an international geopolitical crisis. He looked mildly irritated that his evening plans had been interrupted. I am preventing a continental bloodbath, Your Majesty. I squeaked, tying the silk sack into a knot. I'm Pakink. You have to marry Princess Aylin. You can't fight the Northern Kingdom over a chef who faked her way through a culinary exam with strawberry mochi. Li Jie crossed the room in 3 massive strides. He grabbed the silk sack from my hands, tossed it effortlessly over his shoulder into the koi pond, and gripped my shoulders. Hey, my spatula was in there. I will buy you 1,000 spatulas, Li Jie growled, his obsidian eyes locking onto mine with a fierce intensity. Listen to me. I am the Blood Tyrant. I have conquered 3 provinces before breakfast. I am not afraid of the Northern Kingdom, and I am certainly not marrying a woman I have never met just to appease Grand Minister Lu's blood pressure. But, no, he interrupted, his thumb brushing over my lower lip, instantly silencing my protests. Trust me, my chaotic tactician. I have a strategy. Just cook the welcome banquet tomorrow. And make it aggressively intimidating. The next evening, the Imperial throne room was transformed into a glittering display of Yen dynasty wealth. I stood hidden behind the intricately carved wooden screens near the Imperial dais, peering through the slats. Princess Aylin of the Northern Kingdom had arrived. She was quite frankly a walking web novel cliché. She didn't walk, she floated. She had skin the color of fresh milk, lips like crushed rose petals, and she smelled faintly of expensive lilies. She was currently seated in the center of the room, playing a classical zither with such tragic, heartbreaking elegance that half the council of elders were weeping openly into their sleeves. I looked down at my flour-stained trousers, and the slight garlic burn on my left knuckle. I felt like an absolute potato. A highly stressed, aggressively British potato. Emperor Li Jie lounged on his golden throne, resting his chin on his fist. He looked thoroughly, magnificently bored. Every time Princess Aylin batted her impossibly long eyelashes at him, he subtly rolled his eyes toward the wooden screen where he knew I was hiding. As the final, haunting chord of the zither faded, the court erupted into polite, aristocratic applause. Grand Minister Lu stepped forward, his chest puffed out so far he looked like a proud pigeon. Magnificent. A display of ultimate refinement. Your Majesty, Princess Aylin is the pinnacle of grace. She will bring peace to the borders and elegance to your inner court. When shall we draft the marriage edict? Li Jie slowly sat up. He swept his dark gaze over the assembled nobles, the northern diplomats, and finally, the beautiful princess. Princess Aylin, Li Jie's deep baritone echoed off the vaulted ceiling. Your music is adequate. However, the Empress of the Yen dynasty cannot survive on music alone. She must be my equal in all things. She must defend my life, stabilize my bureaucracy, and understand the deepest, darkest desires of my soul. Aylin smiled demurely, bowing her head. I live only to serve your Majesty's desires. Excellent, Li Jie said, leaning forward. Tell me, Princess, if a Southern Way assassin attempts to poison my finishing wine, are you prepared to neutralize the threat by synthesizing a bowl of the crimson lava of Londinium? Princess Aylin blinked. Her perfect smile faltered. The crimson what, sire? The lava of Londinium, Li Jie repeated deadpan. It is a highly classified, radioactive poultry dish. It requires an aggressive violence of chili. I have never heard of such a thing, she stammered, looking frantically at her diplomats. Disappointing, Lia Sighed. Let us move to statecraft then. Can you explain the complex yarn math required to maintain the structural integrity of the imperial bureaucracy? If one noble family pulls the dough too tightly, how do you prevent the mandala of sovereign tension from collapsing? Minister Lu turned purple. Your Majesty, you are asking her riddles about bread. I am asking her about the fundamental architecture of my empire, Minister Lu. Li Jie snapped, his voice cracking like a whip. He turned his gaze back to the trembling princess. I will ask you one final question, Princess Aylin, Li Jie said, his voice dropping to a dangerous low rumble. When the state affairs are concluded, when my generals are exhausted, the night is dark, and the banter is flowing, are you capable of executing a flawless, extra-hot cheeky Nando's? The entire court stared at the emperor in horrified, absolute silence. Princess Aylin burst into tears. She dropped her zither and covered her face with her silk sleeves. I do not know who this Lord Nando is. I am a princess, not a barbarian. Li Jie stood up, towering over the dais. If you cannot provide the banter and the flame-grilled poultry, princess, then you are entirely unfit to rule beside me. The marriage is cancelled. The northern diplomats may return home with my regards. Minister Lu lost his mind. He slammed his cane into the obsidian floor so hard it splintered. This is treason to the ancestors. You reject a royal bride because she cannot cook peasant food. Because she does not know the tricks of that insolent, cross-dressing boy in your kitchen. Li Jie's hand dropped to his sword. The temperature in the room plummeted to sub-zero. Careful, Minister Lu, Li Jie whispered, the deadly threat echoing through the massive hall. I will not be careful. Lu shrieked, pointing a shaking finger directly at the wooden screen where I was hiding. He has bewitched you. You plan to throw the empire into war for the sake of a male chef. I couldn't take it anymore. I kicked the wooden screen aside. It fell to the floor with a deafening crash. I marched out onto the obsidian floor, my midnight blue silk robes billowing around me. I bypassed the weeping princess, ignored the horrified gasps of the Council of Elders, and stopped directly in front of Grand Minister Lu. First of all, Minister Lu, I said loudly, reaching up to the collar of my robes and unfastening the top 3 clasps, letting the stiff fabric fall open just enough to reveal the distinctly feminine cut of my white silk undershirt. I pulled the jade pin from my hair, letting my long, dark curls cascade down my back. A collective, high-pitched gasp ripped through the 200 nobles. Zhang, standing near the back, actually fainted. I am not a boy, I declared, staring the minister down. My name is Chloe. And second of all, it's not peasant food. It's an internationally recognized franchise, and it is delicious. I turned to look at Li Jie. The Blood Tyrant was staring at me, his chest heaving, a look of absolute, overwhelming worship in his dark eyes. Well, I asked him, crossing my arms, are you going to let him execute me, or are we going to have a cheeky Nando's? Chapter 15. The silence in the throne room was so absolute, so profoundly deep, that you could have heard a single grain of rice hit the obsidian floor. Grand Minister Lu's mouth was opening and closing like one of my tragic, deep-fried sweet and sour carps. The Council of Elders looked as though they had been collectively struck by lightning. Princess Aylin had stopped weeping and was just staring at my cascading curls, completely baffled by the sudden appearance of a woman who smelled aggressively of roasted garlic and rebellion. And then, from the back of the room, there was a loud, hollow thump as Zhang, who had briefly regained consciousness, saw me, realized he had been verbally abusing a woman for a month, and promptly fainted a second time. A woman, Minister Lu finally choked out, his voice a strangled, high-pitched wheeze. He pointed his splintered cane at me, his hand trembling so violently it looked like he was trying to cast a spell. A woman, disguised as a man, in the sacred Imperial Kitchens. Deceit. Treason. This is a capital offense punishable by the removal of. By absolutely nothing, Emperor Li Jie interrupted, his voice slicing through the hysteria like a newly sharpened cleaver. He didn't just walk down the steps of the golden dais. He descended like a dark, vengeful god of war. The sheer force of his presence parted the sea of panicked nobles. He didn't look at Minister Lu. He didn't look at the northern diplomats. His obsidian eyes were locked entirely on me. He stopped inches away, his towering frame completely shielding me from the glaring court. He reached out, his warm, calloused hands gently grasping my face. He didn't care that 200 of the most powerful people in the continent were watching. He didn't care about the laws of the ancestors. He ran his thumbs over my cheekbones, his eyes burning with a possessive, overwhelming heat that melted my tax law-oriented brain into a puddle of absolute mush. You took your hair down, he murmured, a devastatingly beautiful smile breaking across his face. It was getting incredibly itchy, sire. I whispered back, my heart hammering against my ribs. Your Majesty! Minister Lu shrieked, completely losing whatever shred of sanity he had left. You cannot ignore the law. She has defiled the kitchen. And worse, you have insulted the Northern Kingdom. The diplomats will call for war. Blood will spill over this peasant girl. Li Jie didn't even turn his head. Eunuch Wang. Yes, Imperial Majesty. Wang squeaked, stepping out from behind a pillar. Arrest Grand Minister Lu for attempting to dictate the romantic affairs of the Son of Heaven, and for continuously referring to the greatest culinary genius in the world as a peasant, Li Jie commanded lazily. Put him in the dungeon. Feed him nothing but the boiled, flavorless sea cucumbers he loves so much. Two massive, heavily armored palace guards immediately seized the screaming, flailing Minister Lu and dragged him out of the throne room. The Council of Elders collectively took 3 large steps backward, suddenly finding the obsidian floor incredibly interesting. But the lead diplomat of the Northern Kingdom stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. The minister was right about one thing, Emperor Li Jie. You have humiliated Princess Ailin. You have rejected our alliance for a cook. The Northern King will not stand for this insult. We will close the trade borders. We will march our armies. I peeked around Li Jie's broad shoulder. The thought of a war starting because I couldn't keep my mouth shut about peri-peri chicken was too much for my conscience. I was a student of London. We solved conflicts through aggressive diplomacy and heavily taxed negotiations. Wait. I stepped out from behind Li Jie, raising my hands. Diplomat sir. Let's look at the data. Let's analyze the market. The diplomat blinked, completely thrown off guard. The market. Yes, I said, slipping back into my corporate accounting persona. Princess Ailin is lovely, but she doesn't want to live here. The Emperor works 100-hour weeks, he has an unnatural tolerance for capsaicin, and he executes people before breakfast. It's a toxic work environment for a spouse. Princess Ailin, still sitting by her zither, nodded frantically in agreement. What your king truly wants is economic stability, yes. I continued, pacing the floor like a professor giving a lecture. Wealth. A monopoly. So, I propose an alternative alliance. An exclusive, international franchise agreement. The entire court was staring at me as if I were speaking an alien language. Even Li Jie looked utterly fascinated, crossing his arms and watching me work. I will give you the recipe for the extra hot cheeky Nandos, I declared, my voice echoing in the hall. I will give you the chemical ratio of the crimson lava of Londinium. I will teach your blacksmiths how to forge the vertical iron spits for the midnight scholar kebabs. We will grant the Northern Kingdom the exclusive, tax-free rights to open Bao's imperial late-night taverns across your entire border. The diplomat stared at me. He looked at Li Jie. He looked back at me. My king is very fond of roasted meat, the diplomat said slowly. It's not just meat, I promised, leaning in. It's a lifestyle. It cures seasonal depression. It creates unbreakable bonds of banter between soldiers. You will monopolize the late-night tavern economy of the entire continent. Within a year, your GDP will skyrocket. The diplomat rubbed his chin. Will you include the architectural bread? The mandala? I'll throw in the garlic bread formula, I countered fiercely. But the bread not stays here. The diplomat slammed his fist against his chest in a formal salute. The Northern Kingdom accepts these terms. The franchise alliance is forged. Long live the Yen dynasty. The tension in the room vanished so fast it practically created a vacuum. The court erupted into bewildered, relieved murmurs. I had just prevented a war with the promise of franchise kebabs and garlic bread. I turned back to Li Jie. He was looking at me with such intense, unbridled worship that I thought my knees were going to give out again. A cheeky Nando's for a peace treaty, Li Jie murmured, stepping forward and wrapping his arms securely around my waist. Chloe of Londinium, you are a sweet creature. How am I supposed to ever let you out of my sight? You're not, I smiled, looping my arms around his neck. But we need to establish some ground rules. I am not wearing that binding ever again. And I want a modern oven built in the pavilion of the fragrant orchid. Done, he whispered. He turned his head, his dark, commanding gaze sweeping over the silent, terrified nobles of the court. Hear my decree, the Blood Tyrant announced, his voice vibrating through the massive hall, leaving absolutely zero room for argument. The Imperial Kitchen is permanently closed to Minister Lu's absurd traditions. And the Yen dynasty no longer requires a consort selection. I have found my empress. And she is extremely hungry. Li Jie didn't wait for the court to bow. He didn't wait for the scribes to write it down. He simply swept me up into his arms, carrying me bridal style right out of the throne room, leaving the most powerful politicians in the empire staring blankly at a cold, uneaten loaf of braided bread. So, Li Jie purred, his lips brushing against my ear as we marched down the crimson-lacquered corridors. About that chicken. Epilogue. 3 years. That was how long it had been since the Great Kebab Treaty secured the borders of the Yin dynasty. In that time, the empire had not just stabilized, it had exploded into an unprecedented, carbohydrate-fueled golden age. The Northern Kingdom hadn't declared war. Instead, they had become our largest, most aggressively loyal trading partner, entirely because their king had developed a profound, crippling addiction to the extra-hot peri-peri chicken. The border towns were flourishing, lit up every evening by the glowing red lanterns of Bao's imperial late-night taverns, serving exhausted soldiers and traveling merchants shaved lamb off vertical iron spits. The imperial court had also undergone a radical transformation. Grand Minister Liu had been permanently retired to a monastery where the monks had taken a vow of culinary silence, eating only unseasoned rice. The new council of elders was significantly more manageable, mostly because I had introduced the concept of the Friday night pub quiz. Every Friday, instead of arguing about taxes and consorts, the most powerful men in the empire sat at long wooden tables in the courtyard, drinking fermented rice ale and fiercely debating trivia about agricultural yields and poetry. The winning table received a massive platter of bangers and mash. It was highly effective diplomacy. Yet, despite my elevation to Empress of the Yin dynasty, I refused to surrender my kitchen. I stood in the pavilion of the Fragrant Orchid, which Li Jie had upgraded to include a magnificent, brick-lined, temperature-controlled oven that practically functioned like a modern fan-assisted convection unit. I had my sleeves rolled up, my hair tied back in a messy bun with a jade hairpin, and a smudge of flour on my nose. "I am begging you, Your Imperial Majesty," Zhang whimpered. My former rival, now the official head chef of the main palace kitchens, stood in the doorway, clutching his pristine apron. He looked older, grayer, and perpetually stressed by my existence. "Zhang, it's going to be brilliant," I promised, furiously whisking a bowl of eggs, milk, and flour into a smooth, bubbling batter. "You told me the translation of this dish," Zhang said, pointing a trembling finger at the sizzling iron pan resting near the hearth. Inside the pan, 6 massive, savory pork sausages were aggressively browning in hot pork fat. "You called it the toad in the hole." Eunuch Wang, who was standing a safe distance away holding a silk towel, visibly shuddered. "Empress Chloe, His Majesty is the Son of Heaven, the Blood Tyrant, the conqueror of the 4 provinces. You cannot serve him amphibians trapped in a trench. It is a curse. The ancestors will weep." "There are no actual toads, Wang," I sighed, pouring the golden Yorkshire pudding batter directly into the pan over the sizzling sausages. The batter immediately hit the smoking hot fat, hissing and bubbling violently. "It's a metaphor. It's a classic, rustic dish from Londinium. The sausages peek out of the rising batter like little toads looking out of a hole. It's endearing." "It sounds like a plague," Zhang muttered darkly. Before I could defend the honor of British pub food, the heavy wooden doors of the pavilion swung open. The temperature in the room instantly shifted. The palace guards stationed outside bowed so deeply their helmets scraped the stone floor. Emperor Li Jie strode into the kitchen, bringing with him the scent of sandalwood, crisp autumn air, and absolute authority. 3 years of marriage had done nothing to diminish the sheer, overwhelming impact of his presence. He was still the Blood Tyrant. He still wore midnight blue and crimson silks that accentuated his impossibly broad shoulders, and his obsidian eyes could still make a seasoned general weep with a single glare. But when those dark eyes landed on me, the lethal edge vanished entirely, replaced by a soft, possessive warmth that still made my tax law-oriented brain short-circuit. "Leave us," Li Jie commanded quietly. Zhang and Eunuch Wang didn't need to be told twice. They practically evaporated into thin air, bolting out the door and pulling it shut behind them. Li Jie crossed the kitchen in 3 long strides, wrapping his arms around my waist from behind. He pulled me back against his solid chest, burying his face in my neck. He let out a long, heavy exhale, the tension of ruling an empire visibly melting off his frame. "Let me guess," I murmured, leaning back into his embrace and resting my hands over his. "The Minister of Agriculture was complaining about the irrigation budgets again?" "He spoke for 2 hours, Li Jie groaned, his lips brushing against my collarbone. I was very close to having him thrown into the koi pond. The only thing that kept my blade sheathed was the promise of my Empress's chaotic culinary arts. He lifted his head, peering over my shoulder at the oven. What is that phenomenal smell? It smells of rendered fat, toasted wheat, and absolute barbarism. It's called toad in the hole, I said proudly. Lia Froze. He slowly turned me around in his arms, his dark eyebrows raised in aristocratic disbelief. You are feeding me toads? No, Ligia, it's just sausages baked in a savory batter. It puffs up, it gets crispy on the edges, and we drown the entire thing in thick onion gravy. A devastating, wicked smile broke across his face. He reached up, his thumb gently wiping the smudge of flour from my nose. You are a menace to the imperial traditions, Chloe from Londinium. And you love it, I challenged, looping my arms around his neck. I do, he whispered, his voice dropping to that low, velvety register that made my toes curl. More than my throne. More than my life. I would eat 1,000 actual toads if you asked me to. Good to know, I laughed, just before he leaned down and captured my lips. That's where this love story ends for now. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more romantic twists. Tell me in the comments what will you have done. Until the next story, keep craving romance.